What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned in to episode 7 of The Last Dope Intellectual.
All right, y'all. So we have an interesting topic this week for Shoot the Shit, but before we get to Shoot the Shit, we want to acknowledge our new patrons. So we have Sean Horner, Desi Banani, Michael Kelly, and Anita Chikatour. Thank you all for subscribing and helping us to pay our producer.
Thank you. And what up, Anita? Anita's my Carlton colleague friend, so appreciate you, sis.
Did I say her name right then?
You did. That's how I was saying it. So anyway, y'all, here is the question for Shoot the Shit that I want us to consider. Is wokeism actually a thing? And who is the culprit of this? Is it academics? Is it activists? Is it regular, just regular unaffiliated people? Is it the Twitterverse? I'm interested in y'all's thoughts on this whole discourse about wokeism.
That's the thing. I think that part of the problem to your question is we don't really know the origin, but people speak on it like we do know the origin. So some people put it on activists, some people put it on Twitter, and that is like a smorgasbord of activists and academics or whatever. Some people just put on the academy as if the academy is this radical space, as both you know even more intimately than I do, that's just not the case. Some people put it on liberals. So I'm saying and this is what drives me crazy about a lot of discussions is people are speaking like there's this universal understanding and then there's not. So you just get a bunch of folks talking past each other. So I first heard about wokeness from you just in black spaces, right? And it was just Badu was saying this shit in songs and shit, back when I was in college, which is a long time ago at this point, right? That was when I first heard stay woke. And it was a positive thing. And then somewhere within the last few years, it started popping up in these white left spaces, and you started also hearing it attached to identity politics, which we also know gets appropriated as being something that it's not. So I think if we can't even figure out what the origin of it is, I don't even think we can say wokeness is really a thing. It's just really whatever you've defined it as. It's almost like how we talk about other issues, like when you think about if it's a welfare queen or something, or some type of poor black people, and you have these really stereotypical definitions based on your relationship with somebody you just don't like, and then you apply that to the whole community. And I don't know. I don't really know what we're talking about half the time. So I think there's a sentiment of people who are extremely self-righteous that people I think kind of can agree on. There's this group of people that no one cannot clearly identify that's clearly self-righteous, overbearing, and doesn't seem to understand or read the room and talks down to people because they don't know a certain language or they don't take a certain type of politic. And I do think that those people exist. I just don't know if they exist in this kind of homogenous cluster that people like to talk about.
Gang.
Yeah, I definitely same. I don't know where it comes from, but I do think I think that there's been in sort of public discourse, I think even among black people, maybe even among left circles, thinking about a sleeping masses, right? And waking up a sleeping giant. So the language about being awake or even in relationship to thinking about people as zombies, right? And that they're in this kind of weird, almost undead, not dead, liminal kind of space. I think there's something there, and I don't want to give all that to the critique of wokeness or wokeism, right? So I do think there's something. I think there's something useful in the general sort of terminology, which is about keep your eyes open, paying attention. I think it's a very basic directive or description of a phenomenon that I don't think we have to lose to however it's being weaponized or manipulated to either target certain groups or hide other groups. And I don't know, not target, hide wasn't the word that I meant. I don't know what word I meant. But I do think that there is value in thinking about paying attention. Now this then becoming what you talked about too, this kind of a particular kind of self-righteousness. I mean, there is an issue with that, but when we're talking about stay woke, we're also talking about real life and death politics. Like people are saying, pay attention to the shit that's actually killing us. Like, and sleep is death and sleep are often compared to one another. So I don't really know. Like I don't necessarily know that I pay so much attention to the kind of critique of woke culture or wokeness. So like I think so the initial question was like, is wokeism a thing, and like what's the issue with wokeism? I mean, if we're I don't know. If we're referring to people who just know how to say the right things at the right times, I mean, that's empty, shallow language. But I think that there is something, useful and expedient in thinking about being awake and aware.
Yeah, so it's interesting that both of you made like a particular suturing of like wokeness and wokeism, because I use the term wokeism intentionally as a sort of the first of all, people use the term wokeism when they're critiquing being woke or like wokeness, right? But I also wonder is when things congeal into an ism, like an ideology, like a way that one must do things, is that the sort of essence of it becoming like problematic, where it is reduced to having the right language and in your fucking Twitter bio having like everything like, abolitionist, neurodiverse, I don't litter, skateboard on the weekend, but only when, watch out for, all that shit, free Palestine, free Lil Boozy, all that shit, right? It's like a particular type
not
of,
free Lil Boozy
not free Lil Boozy, because actually it'll be like incarcerate Lil Boozy, I guess. Abolitionist, incarcerate Lil Boozy, though, because his gender shit is fucked up. I don't know, but you know what I'm saying? Where you got to put all your credentials out there, and it has to cover like it has to be a blanket fucking. You have to tick all the boxes, right? And then that all of a sudden gives you either it gives you like a sit, you can be centered because you have the right things to say, or that it's just a sort of performance of a particular type of engagement, whether or not one is engaged. But again, I wonder if this critique of like wokeism, if that's actually a thing, or if that's like a right-wing way of evading of sort of putting forth this cancel culture discourse, and of evading the ways that, as you were saying, people actually do need to be aware of all of these structures of domination that are happening. And so I guess for me, I'm conflicted, because on the one hand, it seems like wokeism as a sort of pejorative is turning everything into an ism, where like every form of marginalization becomes a form of structural domination, when it's not exactly that. So we start talking about all of these isms that to me become like a permutation of identity in problematic ways. But on the other hand, I think that it was woke when it came about was a way of naming, right, a particular type of political consciousness. And it's similar to like just, the conscious rap or conscious community having an awareness of what's going on and being able to talk about it in a way that that doesn't have to be abstract or pedantic, but be able to name these things and to be able to interrogate them, how they're happening structurally, but also how you as an individual are perhaps reproducing them in like your own life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the like coming up with new terms sometimes is problematic in and of itself, because I mean I think that's just neoliberalism. Like the whole point of just trying to basically sell yourself as a brand that is socially conscious or whatever, socially responsible or whatever term you want to use, and people call that woke or whatever, but that's just neoliberalism. Like sometimes we already have words for things and we don't need new terms, right? Like that's just so it's like we don't need to somehow hijack something that was in black culture, that was a way of being really was just a form of awareness. Like Nas said, I never sleep, cause sleep is the cousin of death. Like we've been saying shit like that in some way, shape, or form. There's been colloquialisms for that forever, because when you're in a colony, and you're in a situation that we're in, you do need to be aware. You do need to know what's going on, and that's all that was really, like Layla basically said. That's all we were saying. So like, how it becomes this thing where it's like wokeism because they're trying to get you and tell you everybody is racist. I would say that's not only just a right wing attack. I think that's also a right left wing attack as well, because you hear this among a lot of these white social Dems, particularly here lately, where they're trying to break away because they think that's losing elections. And this is what I mean by conflating things, because like that's their ground zero for everything. And then any other time that we want to handle an issue, that somehow is fucking up whatever they got going on. Like all of us even care about that, right? Like that's the only thing. So woke people, whoever we are, right, on a given day, we ruin the Virginia governor election. Woke people is why the Democrats are gonna lose the House and the Senate in 2022. Not the fact that they can't pass shit. Not so it becomes also an escapism because they don't have to actually own anything. Neither side, like the right, which very much has their own version of wokeism, if we're gonna use that term. Like, I mean, they literally push people out of their party who don't ride with Trump. Like,
Yeah,
dudes
it's
is
called white
literally
supremacy. That's their wokeness. It's called
right. That's what I'm
unite the
saying.
right.
So there's a signifier for everybody, but like they just use wokeness, and it's a signifier about a particular young group of people who are usually people of color who are queer. Like they're also signifying things in that language. That's why I don't like the way that term is used. Like I've criticized it when I first noticed it, and then I there's actually a poem I wrote where I took the lines out because I just don't want anything to do with that crowd. Like I don't, because I was more so getting at the self-righteousness that we were talking about, but self-righteousness expresses itself in all kinds of sectors. It can express itself in a nationalist sect. It can express itself in intersectional places. Like that's just a way that happens when people get too close together and things become too much of an echo chamber.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I also think, I also think the idea about wokeism, I think to your point, CBS, about it being a sort of either a creation of the right, or in particular, I think it is about a particular way of silencing, right? Because I think, I've had the experience my whole life being in a group of friends where, I don't know, some sideways comment is made. And if you're the person that calls that out for whatever reason, in whatever ways that it's problematic, then you're somehow buzzkill. And that's a very sort of low level of it, right? Like we're not talking about at the level of actual like sort of state or international politics. People are like, oh, can't we just have fun, right?
No,
But actually, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about you thinking about yourself as a curmudgeon all the time, right? That was actually the word that came up in my mind. But I do think it is about a way of people wanting to just rest and settle in their own ignorance and not wanting to, like when I don't know. Like I think we're all properly sensitized to the ways non-Black people use the N-word, but I don't think we have, and I don't particularly use it. I know other people do. It's not a word that I use regularly. But I mean, I pay attention to or talk about those same kinds of things amongst my Black friends when they make comments about immigrants or have a sort of lack of, so I think there are some ways, like on a very basic kind of day-to-day level, that's like, don't kill my vibe type shit. Like, let me just joke around or whatever. But I do think we have to understand the ways that quelling that in our everyday, in our day-to-day interactions makes us even less likely to bring it up when the stakes are even higher, right? And so that is something that I think about when it's like, oh, we can't point out shit or call out shit or just offer up a critique. Like maybe that's not actually the way we want to frame things. I think we do have to. I mean, for me, that's what wokeness means, and I don't want to divest from that because somebody else is making it into, like, as you say, CBS and ism.
Mm-hmm, yeah, I don't identify as woke. I just identify as a revolutionary or a burgeoning or developing revolutionary because I'm still petty bouge, I guess. But I think, but I do think there's something to be said about like tone policing or the way that people do the shit in a way that's very irritating. Like, well, somebody's explaining like, okay, they're experiencing homelessness. And you're like, you're houseless. Bitch, shut the fuck up. Like, I ain't got nowhere to live. What you mean? You know what I mean? Like, it's come on. And then it's like, and then when it can delve into all of these sort of permutations of marginalization that then become the central thing, like, moisturism. Like we have a moisturism in our culture where we marginalize ashy people and we really condemn ashy heels and be, and we need to, it's like, come the fuck on, bro. Like
I will condemn your ashy heels. I will.
You can, and it's just like, how dare you? Like, these ashy ankles come from a life of toil or whatever people say. I don't know, but it's like, I'm being facetious, obviously.
But
no, yeah. Things that can happen. right? And then the things that may seem trivial all of a sudden become like the discourse, and you're like, my guy, though, like, yes, we don't want to marginalize people, but stop conflating marginalization and oppression, one, and making a sort of, I don't know. I just feel like, to me, that can be the sort, quote unquote, like what they call wokeism, but that also is just sort of like an overzealousness with inclusion in a way that then just becomes counterproductive.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
true. When you said that, sorry, I was just,
go
when you
ahead.
said it, made me think about, my dad is a construction worker, and I used to always make jokes with him about, why your hands so rough? So, and he's like, cause I work. He said, so I'll be sitting around just putting lotion on my hands all the time.
You're moisturous. Like, I think that that's so fucked up. And, you just on here spreading your moisturism on this podcast. Like, how
Clearly.
Oppression. Yeah, I mean, I think, I forgot what I was going to say. I think, no, I mean, I think there's clearly, like, it could go both ways. So, like, there's, like, I think both y'all make good points. Like, there's definitely on one side, I've been on both sides of this, where I'm the person that's clearly ruining everybody's mood, because I'm like, no, that's bullshit, and we need to be honest about whatever it is, it's bullshit. Like, and I'm not going with it. And then on the other side, there are times where just like, yo, shut the fuck up, like, or you don't know what you're talking about. Like, I remember one time I was talking to this girl, and she was like, the baby boomers, they had no sense of self-care, or or something like that, right? And she was talking particularly about the old black generation, but I'm like my grandfather, for instance, worked 2 8-hour jobs for 38 years, right? I don't, like, he had to do that. It's so what the fuck is self-care when you got to work 16 hours a day, right? Like,
Rosa Parks did yoga. So, like, let's be clear. Rosa Parks did yoga. And they're all, what do you think that all that gathering together is? Going to church, worship. It's not, no, they wasn't going to the spa, but they were caring. How do you think they fucking persisted? They were caring for one another and themselves, period.
Yeah, but it becomes this thing where, because they don't do it the way we do it, it becomes this kind of, looking back on history and revising it, or this kind of revisionism or whatever. So that's another thing I noticed with it, where it's like, sometimes when people take it too far, they use their terms or their understanding of the world today, and they try to read the past the way they read it today, and that's just not an accurate, like, things had to progress or evolve to where they are. So there are definitely times where sometimes people they just don't know what they're talking about. You have fundamentalists, you have evangelicals of any particular line of thought, and those people are annoying no matter what you believe in. Like, that's why I don't know how it becomes this left thing, or this just the activist thing. Like, those type of people are annoying in any situation. Like, I mean, I don't care anything. Like, you go to church, if you're an atheist, like, those people are annoying in general, because they don't know how to, like, just be with people. Like, they are just too into whatever, because of whatever situation they got going on. But that's what I was saying at the beginning. That's not a particular persuasion, and there's no way we can really identify or, like, clamp down, like, this is where it is. But it becomes this thing that's destroying democracy that never existed, or it becomes this thing that's, ruining the world, because of an online discourse that the media chooses to engage in often. I mean, if they'll one side they'll tell us only about 5% of the population is on Twitter, but then you cater to Twitter all the time, and you want to blame us? Like, you could really just not listen to us on Twitter if we're not that important. So it's like, on one side, the left mob is this big deal that's ruining the country, and then the other side, we're insignificant, we're unrealistic, all. So it's like, you can't have it both ways. Like, make up your mind. Are we just these crazy people who are extremists? If we're such a small extremist group, then why are you complaining so much? Like, which one is it? So I'm saying, this stuff, just a lot of the times you just look at things, the definitions don't hold up.
Yeah. It's to distract from the fact that they ain't doing shit. Basically, yeah. It's kind of like, and the thing that is really, really true about our society is that capital funds its own opposition, right? It makes up its own opposition. And so we see it happening not only with, like, the CRT and, like, the wokeism stuff, but it's sort of like even the things that become, like, virtuous, or things that become, like, progressive, and whatever, things that are progressive that become hegemonic, like, people getting State Department money for a lot of things because capital wants to attack the oppositions that it can incorporate or defeat, right? And so I just think that all of this, again, I don't really have any answers or whatever. It's just obviously errant thoughts, but it's interesting how this sort of wokeism thing is coming up alongside like the cancel culture, and I just wonder about that. Like, what does this mean for real on both sides?
Or culture war is another term I hate, but
Culture war is old though. That was like an 80s term.
I'm saying that's like a progression. Like wokeism is a progression of that terminology of like culture wars. Now it's wokeism, But
yeah, that's true.
Okay, y'all. So for this week's planting thoughts, I picked one of CBS's faves. So this is a Tradescantia, sometimes called an inch plant, a spiderwort. It's native to the Americas. I told you all I would try to tell you all about toxicity. So it's not necessarily toxic, but it will cause some irritation. So also don't let your pets and kids chew on this. But this particular plant, one of the things that I like about this, so this is one of the plants that if you want it to grow, you actually have to prune it regularly. And so I don't know, for whatever reason, I think about it in terms of like, hair, natural hair, hair in general. If you want your hair to continue to grow sort of full and healthy, you have to sometimes, trim it back, regularly trim it back to get it to grow fuller. And so that's actually one of the things that I like about this particular plant. It can grow all different kinds of ways, but it can grow long. Like if you want it to actually just sort of trail, you can keep trimming it, in one sort of direction. But if you want it to get full and bushy, you need to regularly prune it so that it will get bigger. And so for me, this plant sort of helps me think about the ways that you kind of have to constantly sort of step back, reassess, and reevaluate situations. So this week's plant is a Tradescantia, one of Shereeze's favorites. And yeah, that's what we have for this week. All right, we're very excited. We have a special guest with us this week, Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna Gray was the National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign. Before joining Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign in March 2019, she was a columnist and senior politics editor at The Intercept, who focused on progressive political messaging as well as issues relating to identity and culture. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, New York Magazine, Rolling Stone, Current Affairs, and The Week, among others. Her insights regarding the weaponization of identity in the contemporary political sphere can be found in the Fusion documentary Trumpland, Kill All Normies, as well as a variety of podcasts and online programs, including NPR, TYT, and the Real News Network. Prior to joining The Intercept, she practiced law at a boutique litigation firm in New York City and was contributing editor to the Current Affairs magazine. She is also the co-host of the podcast Swati, Someone's Wrong on the Internet, on which she applies a leftist lens to subjects relating to both politics and pop culture. She received a JD from Harvard Law School in 2011 and a BA from Harvard College in 2007. She lives in Washington, D.C. and hosts Bad Faith Podcast and The Debrief on Call-In. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. That was probably a little dated. Spody hasn't been in existence since I think 2018, but I love some throwback Spody love because that podcast was near and dear to my heart.
Wonderful.
Yes, and you have been have hosted or been on or ran point on several podcasts. I didn't realize that, so that's really dope.
Yeah, life has thrown podcasts at me in a way that I didn't necessarily expect. But what's funny is back in the day, when I was in college, I did an internship at Science Magazine one summer, and they had us do this thing that was like a radio show for the computer back before anybody even used the word podcast. And one of the weeks of the rotation we had during that internship was to make a podcast. And I remember loving it. It was like my favorite weekend of the week of the whole summer, but didn't, have any idea that was a thing that was going to emerge in the media sphere or that that's something that anyone could ever make a living off of. So I do feel like I've come full circle in that it is my raison d'etre in some ways to be a podcaster.
Yeah, it's very weird that podcasting has exploded in the way that it has. But so for people who have been living under a rock and who don't necessarily know who you are, can you explain explain like what your political ideological orientation is, and maybe give us a sense of what your political or ideological development has been over time?
Sure. I mean, I think that like a lot of people, maybe not a lot of people who listen to this podcast are people like yourselves who I think have had a more well-developed sense of personal politics for longer than I have. 2016 was a real turning point that highlighted the extent to which my personal politics and ethics weren't being represented broadly in our national political system. The contrast, it was always there, but it wasn't, foregrounded because there had never really been a candidate on a national level that I could more closely identify with the way that I did with Bernie Sanders in his 2016 run. And as I began to have conversations with my peers about why it was that I supported Bernie and what it was that I found so lacking in other candidates that were, Hillary Clinton, but before the start of that race, why I hadn't particularly been as engaged in politics before, it became clear that there were some deeper ideological divides that were being covered by this label of kind of liberal or progressive or Democrat. And, I'm someone who was raised in a family where there was always a large degree of openness to questioning all kinds of orthodoxy, including political orthodoxy. My mother's father was a radical of his time. He was in the Nation of Islam. He raised her to be, extremely kind of anti-authoritarian. And, my mother always says, she went to Howard, both my parents met at Howard. And she says, I had already basically read all my freshman year reading material before I got to school because that was kind of required in our household. And she's someone who never really voted for a Democrat until Barack Obama, was a Green Party voter, was very open to the idea of alternative kinds of politics. And so I think when someone like Bernie came along, it was a no-brainer for me in a way that it wasn't necessarily for folks that identified very strongly with the Democratic Party as a kind of identity. And what it was substantively that appealed to me about Bernie Sanders and the broader kind of movement that's emerged since then is a focus on human rights and interest as opposed to a kind of incrementalist pragmatism that I think really flies in the or it is disrespectful to the everyday misery that people disproportionately, my own people, experience. And there is an erasure of the extent to which incrementalism is really sentencing historically marginalized groups to a standard of living in a space in American society that I find to be unconscionable. And I think it's unconscionable to be asking people to wait for more generations when we've already been waiting so long. And a political framing that says that there are certain rights that people get because they are human beings, I think really cuts through, a lot of the rhetoric about incrementalism that shores up the corporate Democratic Party and makes people feel like even though they ideologically in the abstract believe what I believe, they're willing to put it off and say, oh, well, Buttigieg is trying his best, Kamala Harris is trying their best, et cetera, et cetera. And having a human rights framework and a moral framework really cuts through all of that in a way that I find to be very personally gratifying.
And you believe that those human rights can be achieved through mainstream electoral politics, despite the realities of the U.S. being like a settler colonial, endemically racist and anti-Black racist, elitist society?
Well, no, I certainly don't think that they can be achieved electorally exclusively. I don't know that I completely am at a place where I'm willing to abandon any interest or engagement with electoral politics. I know that this is an ongoing conversation on the left. I certainly share and perhaps feel even more strongly the frustration with the limits of electoral politics, seeing that I, gave up a career that I cared a lot about to join the Bernie campaign and saw how it was thwarted in not so subtle ways, right? And I don't believe that any real change will be allowed, to be honest. But that also is not to say that I don't think that there is some rhetorical value, some value in running those races and foregrounding for people the extent to which it's going to take other means, right? Watching how Bernie was thwarted, watching how that movement was sidelined electorally, I think was part of the radicalization of a lot of folks who did believe that you could vote and elect your way out of these kinds of things, right? And I think if you don't participate in and showcase the extent to which the existing systems are deeply flawed and are unlikely to lead to liberation, you're unwilling to convince somebody, right, to abandon those systems or at least share their energy with other kinds of efforts.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with you that I know it to be true that for a number of people, Bernie Sanders was a shift. I know even for some people that I was close to, watching the way Barack Obama's campaigns just kind of packed up and moved out after they mobilized all these young people. They were very sort of disillusioned with that too. But I wonder to what degree, one of the things my father will always say is that some lessons we don't have to learn ourselves. Some lessons we can learn from other people. And I think we've learned this lesson generation after generation. And so I'm wondering when we're going to have a sort of collective coming together about that. We could probably talk about that. We'll talk about that more, but I think I'm curious about that as a sort of kind of rolling issue. But shifting gears just for, just a bit, I'm curious for you as a Black woman, how you, one, feel like being a Black woman has shaped your own sort of political ethos and then also how you think or feel it makes you be perceived in political spaces. And then what criticisms have you received related to either your own sort of positionality as a Black woman or sort of your maybe larger critiques about race and gender?
Well, I think being a Black person and in particular having family members who I want to be careful because there are plenty of Black people who have a more bourgeois orientation and have a more bourgeois background that aren't necessarily informed by their racial identity in the same way, right? Some of the earliest writing that I did was about the fact that class is basically absent from a racial analysis in a way that leads to a really reductive view of race that can be weaponized in ways that are frankly destructive to the interests of Black people, right? So I'm hesitating because while I absolutely feel that being Black is a core part of why I don't feel that sanguine comfort and confidence in the American dream that so many people have, I think it's almost more specific than being Black. It has to do with my mother's side of the family, more radical orientation. It has to do with kind of my grandfather's and my grandmother's personal politics and the extent that was impressed upon my mother and then impressed on to me than just being Black, right? Because there are a lot of different Black cultures and there certainly is a perfectly conservative strain of Blackness that exists as well. I think that being Black has afforded me some freedoms to take on certain arguments in the left space without being dismissed as racist, right? I certainly wasn't the first person to write about the ways that identity were being weirdly weaponized, especially in 2016, where it was a Democratic primary between two white people. But if you listen to the discourse, you would have thought that Sister Hillary was something other than white. From the Maya Abuela nonsense to the way that hot sauce in the bag, even if it was a true anecdote, was meant to stand in for some affinity for Black people and Black interests. I believe there was an article that literally referred to her as Sister Hillary. And people would talk about Bernie as he would say things like, he's a white man. And I'm like, true, but they're all white. So what is the whiteness serving in this comparison? Like, what, when we're talking about the choice between two Democratic candidates here, what is pointing out his whiteness serving in the context of a choice between two white people? And so other people would write about this phenomena, but what I was observing is that the kind of the hegemonic liberal media structure would dismiss those arguments immediately as just a racist bro. And we all understand, I mean, I think we all remember how pernicious that Bernie bro stuff was. I mean, you couldn't have an opinion without being called a Bernie bro. And so I do think that I was able to break through in some ways simply because my identity shielded me, like rightly or wrongly, from some of those critiques. Although I will say, there were definitely people who were so kind of identity poisoned that they could not see me. There was one write-up of my article in the Daily Kos where someone literally said, if Briahna, I might believe what Briahna had to say, but I Googled her, and as a white woman, I'm just tired of white people weighing in on this over and over again. I was like, if you Googled me, I'm not sure what picture you think came up, but it's just me. Right? But they literally could not process. Like that was the level of dissonance. So yeah, I do think, I know that my blackness affords me a certain kind of leeway in this space. And I think internally, the fact that I'm black gives me, I think, some confidence to weigh into conversations that other people rightly or wrongly recuse themselves for. Like, I know that I am able to make a critique of the kind of bourgeois black media class that I have talked to some, white fellow leftists, and they say, well, I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. And I'm like, okay, like, I get that, but I'm glad that I have that opportunity to make that critique, because it would be a real shame if the critique went unarticulated.
So I guess I just want to follow up with that question really quickly from a sort of different angle. Do you think that being a Black woman and having a class analysis and a critique of intra-racial class stratification has left you open to critiques about that question, either your Blackness or that make it seem as if you're, I think somewhere I read you're a handmaiden of white supremacy. I didn't quite get that. But, so I guess in terms of the identity, or in terms of being a Black woman, is there a way that having a class analysis is seen as like some white shit or not, or a question of your authenticity? Have you experienced that?
Oh, absolutely. I think I'm white adjacent. That was a term that was bandied about a lot in 2018, 2019. I am the Candace Owens of the left, which it's not really clear. I mean, of the left means that we don't share the same politics. You got a bad term? I mean, right. Not since 2011. So I'm not sure what that means, other than, I noticed that you are both Black women and I don't agree with either of you, which is a beautifully reductive way to see the world. And it's not just from people who are ideologically opposed, right? There's people on the ostensible left who have lobbied that critique at me and have asked me if I feel like I'm Black enough. And that's always such an interesting question to me, that I like to put back to people to say, why don't you think that I'm Black? Say it in words. Like, just say it in words. I'm not offended. I don't have any insecurity about who I am. Because when people are forced to put it in words, it gets revealed is that they have a very reductive view oftentimes of what it means to be Black. That has nothing to do with one's politics or their willingness to go hard for issues that disproportionately affect Black people, and everything to do with some aesthetic or another that is pretty reductive and reduces what it means to be Black to a particular cultural stereotype here and there that really, I think, is disrespectful to the whole gestalt of the Black American experience. So yeah, I have been criticized in those ways, oftentimes by white liberals, to be honest. But it doesn't deter me or really affect me, because I think, like, unlike some of these bourgeois Black commentators, I have never had any insecurity about what it means to be a Black person, and was raised with a healthy sense of self-esteem and love for my cultural and ethnic identity. And I just find it to be a kind of interesting curiosity. And I also think it's a part of a symptom of what identity politics has wrought, the kind of poisoned, weaponized kind of identity politics has wrought, right? Because if I am Black, then they have to contend with my arguments. If I am not black, then you can dismiss me as being somehow like a race traitor or not representative or something like that, the way that they do white people. So there is an effort to unblackify me that's really just part and parcel of a need to avoid having to contend with the substance of what I'm saying.
Well, somewhat relatedly, and this is not necessarily like a dig deep into your personal life kind of question, but I am curious about what that then, as a young woman, ostensibly probably out there trying to have some kind of partnership, whatever that might look like. How do your politics and the way that you engage with your politics affect your ability to find partners out in the world? What is that like for you?
Well, Layla, that is a question. I mean, I don't have to tell either of you what it's like out here in the streets. I mean, I don't know what your guys' relationship status is or anything like that, but statistically, it's not great for our cohort. Let's just say that. What are the statistics? Like, the more educated you are as a black woman, the harder it is. And the statistics are real bleak if you have basically a graduate degree as a black woman. So since I have been so outwardly left, since, I've stopped being a lawyer and my whole politics are out there on Front Street for everybody to see, and since my politics have become a bigger part of my life and what I focus on every single day and what I talk about instead of kind of the background of my day-to-day life, it has become even harder than it was before. Because I think there is a presumption that, I'm black, I'm dating black guys, there's a certain political identity. But what I've discovered, and which I'm sure I don't have to explain to either of you, is there are plenty of black people, including black men, who are ostensibly left because they believe that Black Lives Matter and they want police reform, and they are pained, as we all are, when we see another one of these horrible camera videos of someone being gunned down or strangled to death on the pavement. However, their politics don't really extend beyond that. It's a very I'm rooting for everybody black kind of politics. I may or may not have dated someone who had a I'm rooting for an everybody black mug. Now, his politics developed since then, and he was a 2016 Jill Stein voter, and I loved him for it. But there is a certain kind of just very superficial progressivism that you get when you're dating a lot of people. But the presumption that when you're dating a black person, they are more politically aligned doesn't always follow through and can be a kind of disappointment. And then that culls the herd even more than just looking for whatever you were looking for before.
Just to follow up, when I was on your show, we spoke a little bit about Kamala Harris, right? And the way that her white partner perhaps made her appear even more disembedded from the black community, beyond just her politics and beyond her not being African American in terms of her ethnicity. And so I wonder, given all of these, given your class politics and your support for Bernie and all of these questions or questioning of your black identity, so to speak, do you feel does that sort of also weigh on who you on your mate selection? So that is to say, if you dated a white person, are you ever concerned about how that will reflect on you? Do you, is there any way that figures into how you think about being partnered?
100%. Look, there's one question of whether it's right or wrong to think that way. And we can have that conversation. But I think the reality is that there's an optics game being played here. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it doesn't flit across my mind that there's a certain level of hypocrisy that seems to be playing out when you see folks that are, so down, the dude with his, Africa medallion on and his dashiki, who, that kind of hotep stereotype, who is partnered with a white woman, right? And there does seem to be an inconsistency. Now, people have asked this question and debated it on Clubhouse and all this stuff. Can you be authentically down for the cause while also be in a relationship with someone who isn't black? And, abstractly, I think that the answer is yes. I think that, obviously sometimes, people fall in love for various reasons. It's very difficult to disentangle what is quote unquote sincere feeling from all kinds of culture pressures and stereotypes and presumptions that we've been inculcated with. We live in a white supremacist society, and these values are oftentimes invisible, and we don't really know what we're thinking and doing and how we're acting upon it. Of course that's going to have an effect. I mean, we recently had an episode with Thomas Chatterton Williams, who is a biracial man who's married to a white woman, who's written this book about his kind of come to Jesus moment when his kids came out and they looked like fully white. And what does it mean about his own identity and how we define race and how do we choose partners? And he was worried about this going into a relationship with a white woman. He ultimately decided, I can't make my romantic decisions, my personal decisions based off of politics. And, that's one way to do it. And I perfectly respect that choice. However, I do think there's an extent to which we as a culture, as a broader society, let ourselves off the hook with our relationship choices, believing that on some level the personal should not be political in that one instance, and that it flies against our belief in romance and what love is for there to be anything other than pure emotion driving those decisions. But I don't think you're born thinking that men who are over 6 foot tall are magically better looking. I don't think we're born thinking that, long hair or light skin or any of these things that are valued in society are actually valuable. We're inculcated with those beliefs, right? We're inculcated with beliefs about masculinity and femininity that play out when we look at racial dating patterns across the board. I think there's a reason culturally why the most common interracial pairings are, between black men and white women, and the least are between black women and Asian men, right? Because society says things about masculinity that are appealing, that make black men appealing and Asian men unappealing to the broader, to the American audience, at least. Things are changing. I mean, they got some of these cute young biscuits on these shows like Riverdale and stuff. Asian men are having a moment.
But that man called BTK,
right. Right. And I have the only real interracial, non-black partner that I've had, the only non-black boyfriend that I've ever had was a Chinese American man. And I think part of the reason I was comfortable in that pairing was because it seemed like it wasn't following any script. Like there wasn't a stereotype that I felt like I really had to wrestle with and contend with about why I would say put an Asian American man above a black man. Like that is not something that anybody has been inculcated with to value, anyone in this country, any black person, let's say in this country, to value Asian men above black men. And, there were things about him personally, obviously, that helped to as well in terms of how he grew up and where he was from and all that stuff. But it is something that I am very honest with myself that makes me uncomfortable. It's hard out here. I went on some dates with a guy over the course of the summer, and I think that part of why we couldn't really get past the initial stages was I was kind of very openly wrestling with, can I do it? Can I date this white guy? And it didn't. And there are going to be people who have problems with this. I know I'm getting myself into trouble, but it was difficult because of his politics. It was difficult because of the ways that I presumed that his race was informing his politics, even if it wasn't necessarily the case. I was trying to untangle it all. I would see things in his life that seemed to me to speak of a certain kind of racial privilege, and I would feel resentment about it, even though it wasn't his fault. I saw how he waltzed into a restaurant wearing dirty sneakers and shorts and a white t-shirt, and how he was treated so well, and how I would be dressed to the nines, or with previous black partners who were dressed to the nines and did not get that same amount of treatment. And it made me feel resentment toward him, even though I know intellectually it wasn't his fault. And it's like a whole thing. And I don't know how that's gonna play out. I mean, I think the biggest obstacle was really his politics outside of race, and not being quite as lefty as I was, and him feeling, I think, on some level judged by my politics, like a tacit judgment, which no one wants to feel, and he has every right to not want to be in that kind of a space. But these are the kinds of things that I feel like I'm negotiating. The politics adds another layer on to the kind of racial and cultural and class dynamics that exist when dating already.
Well, we're people are dishonest if they're not saying. We're always judging. When you're dating, that's what you're doing. You are judging. You are
Hello.
judging.
Yeah, see, he would have missed me with the dirty ass shoes. When you said dirty ass shoes, I was like, oh, and shorts? Nah, I'm good.
Oh, poor thing. I feel like I've been trotting him out on the internet a lot when he barely had anything to do with it. I mean, this was a little flash in the pan situation. But yeah, look.
But the way you described him could be any white man in America, because so many of them walk around the world like that. So,
but that's the thing. Like, this is the thing. This is a parallel to a conversation we had with abolitionism, right? Like, I want a world where Black people can dress down if they want to, right? I don't necessarily want a world where he has to dress to the nines. Like, that's who he is. That's his spirit. Like, I liked that he was a free spirit in some respects and outdoorsy and stuff. And it's just the same way, like, when some white person gets off the hook for some crime, it's not that I want more incarceration. Like, I want Black people to get that same treatment by the criminal justice system. So I want to be fair to him, that I'm not necessarily judging how the world treats him. I'm judging how the world treats us.
Yeah, I always say that I think that the limits of our politics are conveyed in our interpersonal relationships. Me and Layla were just talking about this yesterday, whether it's, we're anti-racist, anti-colorist, but all your partners are like, or, we're socialists and believe in economic democracy, but ain't no broke man. Like, it's all of these types of contradictions that we accept in our interpersonal relationships, as you were sort of saying, like, the person was political except for in this way. Sorry, go ahead, Layla.
But I think that it is in both ways. I mean, like, you and I have talked about this a lot. Like, I know that I almost intentionally developed a preference for darker skinned men precisely in response to that preference for light skinned men when I was growing up. And I can't lie and say that that's not political. Like, I know that developed in that way, right? And so I'm not, I think if we have to be more honest with ourselves, and that's my thing about, the way you framed it, Sharice, the sort of limits of our politics, and I think you similarly framed it, Briahna. Like, I don't know, I struggle with this notion that somehow we're building a life where we want to do something in the world, and somehow that is beyond the confines of what our relationships with people that we spend the most time with. Like, I don't necessarily have close friendships with people who don't share my politics. I'm not saying I can't be friends or can't have those kinds of relationships, but if we like, intimacy requires a variety of ways of trusting. And for me, trusting means that you share certain experiences, you share certain understandings. Some things I don't gotta explain to you. If I come home venting about certain things, I don't need you questioning whether or not I'm misreading the situation. I need you to be like, yeah, that was fucked up. Like, that's
yeah, the world is hard enough out there. Having to justify and explain yourself is hard enough all day. I say this all the time. I spend my whole day arguing with people. I professionally argue with people. I'm not trying to have to explain a GD thing when I come home at night. And whether that's fair or not, I don't know, man. But to your point, Layla, about having similar experiences, I mean, I will say that it is not always the case that being with someone who is your own racial identity gets you that validation either, right? So I don't want to be reductive in the same way that we're critical of other people being racially reductive. I was once engaged to a Black Canadian man, Caribbean Canadian man, who, whose racial identity was, from my perspective, from my biased American perspective, I'm not saying objectively, he would feel differently about this, was a void. His racial identity was a void. There was no sense of like broader Black community. I mean, people had their independent, diaspora. I'm Jamaican Canadian. I'm trying not to use where he's actually from because I'm not trying to out his behind either. But, like whatever I'm Ethiopian, Canadian, whatever. But with that lack of kind of broader national Black identity meant that comfort and solace and support that you get from being Black was also absent. So he came into an American context and felt the same slings and arrows that you feel racially of being like, a larger, darker skinned Black man in the world. And I felt observing him that he didn't know how to handle it. He wasn't equipped, I should say, to handle it as well as if he had grown up in America. And I felt like he internalized the racial slights of the world because he didn't have any, too harshly, because he didn't have any natural barrier that built up, or that self-esteem that Black people have created for ourselves. Black women, despite the way that we're maligned romantically and otherwise in society, are rated poll-wise as having a higher self-esteem than other groups. And it's not because we're getting external validation. It's because we've made decisions about ourselves. Like, we are going to have our own metrics to value our own selves the way that we want to, because if we relied on broader society to validate us, we'd all be throwing ourselves off the top of buildings by the time we were 13 years old. Right. So at the same time, he was like, an early fight in our relationship was over plantation weddings. And I made an offhanded statement about how, like, oh, look at these people having these plantation weddings. Like, this is nonsense. And he'd be like, what's wrong with the plantation wedding? My family has a plantation back in Inter Islands.
Would have been gone. Got it. Back it up.
I was like,
back Canada.
Meanwhile, my Chinese American partner from the Bronx, whose parents were postal workers and, had very mixed race kind of friendship groups and community in the Bronx, who went to a predominantly Black and Latino high school, worked as a public defender in the Bronx. I didn't have to explain a GD thing to him. And the fact that he was also from, a racial minority group, and as an Asian man was similarly situated romantically in like the dating space as I didn't feel that vulnerability that can come when your partner can kind of hurt you in ways that you can't hurt them back. Like, the society, if you're in the same way, there's no parallel between like the N-word and cracker or whatever exists. Right. There's like a unilateral, like, you can hurt me more than I can hurt you kind of dynamic that happens when you're with the majority group, that doesn't happen necessarily in the same way when you're with another minority who's been marginalized, not the same way, but in other kinds of ways that are kind of parallel. And so as I go down this journey now and I look around, I'm very conscious of the fact that, in an ideal world, for optic reasons, I know it would be great to be with a Black man. I spent my whole 36 years on this planet trying to chase down a Black man. No one can accuse me of not having tried my darndest. But that one experience that I had with the Chinese American man and also this Black Canadian man make me realize that there's definitely more to it than raw racial identity. And that, the Chinese American guy's identity as an American on a certain level started to matter a lot more to me in the face of this other Canadian guy's attitudes toward race and class and society, etc.
So you miss me again, at Canadian. See, I don't like nobody, but circling back to a sort of conversation we started earlier about identity and etc. I think all of us here are very critical of what we call identity reductionism. As opposed, we make a distinction between identity reductionism and identity politics, because there's some way in which politics should guide the way you understand your identity, as opposed to your identity being your politics, right? Mm-hmm. So we call that identity reductionism. And also the believe Black women discourse, a blanket discourse, something that started around sort of sexual assault, but then got extrapolated to mean don't question Black women, even if they're fucking Condoleezza Rice or whatever. But and also, you have levied criticisms of like wokeism. What's the issue with these discourses from your perspective, and how do you see them being applied in problematic ways, or applied to you in problematic ways? Expectations about you. Yeah.
I mean, today's episode that just dropped was with an author who's made a critique of wokeism, as you say, Batya Ungar-Sargon. And I don't know that it was a great conversation, and people should go and listen to it. I wouldn't make the critique in the way that she does. I remember when woke was a good thing, and when we use that word in a positive way, and I'm a little resistant to completely leaning in to what I think can start as a legitimate critique of certain excesses on the left, but very quickly steamroll into a critique of the idea that we have like systemic problems in America, right? So I want to put that out there, that I don't know that I particularly would say that, I wouldn't necessarily frame it that way. But yeah, I do think that there is sometimes a disconnect that is born from the fact that we have two political parties and a ostensibly bipartisan media system that has been so co-opted and is so controlled by elite corporate interests that the only way to manufacture a split that drives clicks and maintains the fiction that we have a two-party system is to highlight cultural divides, cultural controversies in a way that makes it seem like the Democrats are doing something other than, you know, assault tax and corporate cuts for the rich and all the things that they have always done, welfare quote unquote reform and all of the rest. And so we get a disproportionate focus on things like, you know, CRT or Oprah getting racially profiled because they said that she couldn't afford a $40,000 handbag, or I think that people misdiagnose why we're talking so much about Robin DiAngelo and them. It's not that I necessarily think that, I think that some of the critique of them is overstated. The problem with Robin DiAngelo is that she's doing a corporate HR pitch that has a place in corporate HR world, but it's being extrapolated as some kind of solution to America's racist problems when it really should just be about how to keep girls and, young women and black people from being, marginalized and harassed in the context of their law firm or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a place for it there, but it's not going to solve racism. And that some of the language that's used in those contexts is being drawn out by two people. One, on the liberal side of things, folks who are affluent MSNBC types whose only problem in the world is that they can't rise up on their law firm, or they can't rise up in MSNBC, or they can't rise up in their bourgeois context, right? So of course they're going to really cotton on to that language because it's exactly made for them. And people on the right who see the extent to which that kind of highly academic language is polarizing for white America, poor working class white Americans who don't see themselves as privileged in the way that the discourse talks about, right? When you have a conversation exclusively about racial privilege without class privilege, it erases all the ways in which they are in fact not privileged because they are poor, right? And both sides are advantaged by this discourse in various ways, right? It makes Don Lemon feel righteous and justified, and like, I'm a black man and I'm on the side of right and good because I care about George Floyd, right up until the point I start condemning protests because there's property destruction and suddenly the baby goes out with the bathwater. And on the right, obviously there's an advantage to saying, look how crazy the libs are. They're saying things that fly in the face of your lived experience as a struggling person in America, like most people are, white and black alike. Most poor people in America are white because we're a 70% white country, even if it's disproportionately black and brown. And this is just evidence of why you shouldn't listen to liberals. They are out to get you. They have no sympathy for you and your plight. Meanwhile, working class interests aren't represented in the least anywhere. And when I make a critique of left overreaches, wokeness, whatever you want to call it, it's not a substantive critique of a lot of the analysis that comes out of academia, obviously, but it's a conversation about whether we should be more mindful of the way we talk about some of these phenomena I think are real. Like, I don't think that privilege discourse, intersection discourse, all of that stuff is wrong. But I think when the academic gets conflated with the political discourse, we have to have a real substantive conversation about how that's falling on people's ears. And it's delicate, and it's something that I'm working out every day with guests on the show. To what extent is it, coddling whites, as it were, as what a guest recently put it, said to me, or, caping for whites, as is often put on Twitter, to say we need to be more judicious about how we use words like racism and white supremacy. I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that there's some people who have a view of what white supremacy is, that it's a man in a Klan's hood, where if I go around talking about how everybody who voted for Trump is a white supremacist, even if by one definition of white supremacy I might agree, we're talking past each other. And it's gonna have political negative consequences for a left which is ostensibly trying to put together a broad multiracial coalition that includes some of those people who voted for Trump and who also voted for Obama. And that some of these labels are not a good one size fits all for the political context that we're in today. And I think it's worth having conversations about that, even if I don't necessarily have all the answers or conclusions about whether or not you lose something of yourself and you lose something of your soul by wanting to step away from some of these terms.
I mean, it's interesting, the sort of the white coddling. I mean, yeah, so I don't know that I necessarily have the answers to, but I want like to, sometimes we just have to call a spade, even if people don't like hearing it. And the thing is, it's not the hegemonic discourse. It's just not. Like, the hegemonic discourse is that white people vote for Trump because they're poor, which completely evades the fact that it's because they're poor and white, and because they believe they want to have particular types of entitlements. They want to have particular types of social programs, but they don't want immigrants or Black people or other groups to have it. And I think that, I don't know, I think that it has to be both, and we have to be able to hold both. And maybe they don't realize that's racism, but it is. And maybe not white supremacy, but maybe so. And maybe it needs to be, and maybe using that language, and maybe judiciously, as you say, can help to see, like, when you have this correlation of beliefs is in fact the very basis by which racialized folks have been marginalized and terrorized and all these other things over time.
Well, let me ask you this, and I'm genuinely asking, this isn't like bait. If, as you just said, some of the people who we would describe as racist or white supremacists don't see themselves that way, don't understand themselves in those terms, don't have a systemic view of what racism or white supremacy is, how it operates today. What is gained? I'm sincerely asking, what is gained by using those terms to describe them? Not like in a book somewhere on a campus, but on MSNBC, the way that is happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know about MSNBC. And also, the asterisk is that I don't talk to white folks, especially not those type of white folks. I just don't. Like, literally, like, I am a echo chamber. I'm serious. Like, I teach, the white folks that I teach tend to be elite whites because I teach at particular types of institutions, and then Black radicals. And so, like, but I think that the utility of using those terms, but then unpacking them and saying that, again, this correlation, when you believe in X, Y, and Z, this is historically how racism has operated. I think that one can use those terms and make them legible, and then people can believe it or not believe it, right? But I think, I don't necessarily know how else you would describe particular, and it's also, do people reject it because the way that white people just don't want to be called racist? I don't understand.
But does anyone want to be called racist? Because here's the thing, in my life, so, I mean, not to make this whole thing about my dating life, but I have recently been going on dates with a Latino man. Mm-hmm. And when I am in situations like this, where I'm really forced into close proximity with someone who is neither Black nor white, it reveals all kinds of ways in which I am extremely unwoke and say dumb stuff and am ignorant about a whole host of things. And one could credibly say, Briahna, you're racist. I think we're all racist, and I will own that. I own it. Now, racism as we define it, and powers and system and all of that, do I think I have all of this power over Latino? Yes and no. I have some class advantages, blah, 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 blah. And I get that kind of definition of racism. But I don't want to pretend that that there cannot be racism between groups, that, there was a certain reality about hate crimes against Asian Americans, for instance, that are, a lot of which are being carried out by Black Americans in these urban centers. Like, these are like realities, that there is intersectionality means that it's a little bit more nuanced than this top-down black-white thing, right? And while I am going to sit here and say I can acknowledge my own racism and bias and prejudice that is revealed by something like my current dating situation, I don't also want to be called racist, right? Like, no one likes to be called racist. Like, there is a knee-jerk emotional response that every human being has, rightly or wrongly, and I think we should all be able to suppress it and deal with it and be mature adults. I wish that for everyone. But the reality is, that's not how most people are. I have experienced a pile-on on Twitter about something that I may or may not have actually been wrong about. But to have that knee-jerk response to say, oh, you guys are being unfair, you're making bad faith arguments, I'm going to dig in my heels. And knowing that is like an emotional phenomenon that exists, rightly or wrongly, makes me very skeptical of a kind of politics that relies on or indulges in sometimes a kind of shaming, even if it's accurate and even if it's cathartic for the person who's doing the shaming, and even if the person deserves to be shamed. For me, politically, I just think that there's diminished utility in it, even if it's completely correct. And in an academic context where you have people who have come to learn and are willing to sit with you and are stuck in your class and that you have access to their brains and to convince them for long periods of time, I think it's absolutely appropriate to use that kind of language because you can provide the full context and get them where they need to be. And I think that work has to keep happening. I think that we should make college free for all so that everyone has some exposure to that in an environment where they can have the more substantive lesson, because that's how I learn, right? But politically, I feel a little differently. And it makes me think, the other thing that you said made me think of Heather McGhee's work. And we had her on the podcast and she talked about, she's not as lefty as I am. She doesn't identify as a socialist or anything like that. I think she was a Warren surrogate. But she was the president of Demos and did all of this poll work and studies about what kind of narratives are most effective to what they describe as persuadable voters, like the potential swing voters, the voter that not necessarily the deep, hardcore conservative or Trump voter, but the kind of voters that we can reach to put together this multiracial working class coalition, blah, 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 or at least get Trump out of office or whatever your priorities are, whatever. And the answer wasn't to ignore race or racism or pretend it doesn't exist, but it was to say racism is being used to divide us up. And this might sound very familiar because it's the kind of the Bernie spiel. Racism is being used by elites to divide us up and pit us against each other so that they can hoard wealth and resources for the top. It acknowledges that racism is serving this role and challenges people to not buy into that and to realize that there's more to be gained by joining together than to leaning in to their racist ideals and or racist instincts or whatever you want to call it, and appealing and feeling the benefit of the wages of whiteness. Is to say there are wages of whiteness. There are these cultural, social benefits to being white. But I want to put to you that there's even more benefits to be had by joining up with your black and brown neighbors. And persuasively, that works. Like it is shown to be effective. And when I say I want to change the language, it's not to say to ignore or deny racism, but it's to present it in a way that focuses less on shaming people for being racist, even if they are. Like, I'm not going to argue about that. But to say, I believe in your ability to choose something else. And that kind of Afro-pessimist kind of Ta-Nehisi Coates streak that's taken over black liberalism says the opposite. It says, you are racist. You are kind of intrinsically, immutably racist. Because you're white, you're racist. Your racism is linked to your whiteness, which is a part of your identity that's not going anywhere. And there's something that's very circular and self-defeating where people are basically like, all the whites have to die off, or we got to have enough immigrants to like give us numbers. Like, this is the only solution that liberals have because they have this essentialized view of what race and racism is.
Well, I mean, two things. The one, your racial biases is not the same. People's racial or even ethnic, national biases are not the same as racism. And so that's the first thing. And so I don't know that, so that's one thing. And the second thing is, again, I think that the idea of quote unquote shaming people for being racist, I think that's right? Because it's not about shaming. It's about simply naming things, right? And the thing is that the majority of white people in this country have an aversion to even naming something as it is. It's the same aversion they have to settler colonialism. It's not a shaming thing. It's just, this is what it is. And these are the material consequences. And they just don't want to hear that shit. And so you don't have, by calling something, and the conflation of pointing out how something is racist and that being shaming, I think is the problem. And so I just don't know how to point out the racialized logics that are endemic in particular practices without calling it racist. How else are you going to describe it?
I also don't think, I agree with Sharice about the importance of naming it. And I also just don't know, to make the appeal that, as poor people, white and black, we stand to gain something from it. I think I would be curious about what success looks like. And I think this is like a strictly sort of electoral metric. It's also making me think something we talk on the podcast a lot about the case of Cuba, right? So when we actually think about what it means to have the success of a revolution that created sort of a kind of horizontal material circumstance whereby the sort of daily, like most damning impact of racism seemed to disappear. But then as soon as the sort of material circumstances changed again, then all of the ugliness of racism resurfaced because it wasn't something that they actually named and actually dealt with and actually attacked at an intellectual, ideological, historical level. And so if making that appeal is about getting people to vote for a particular candidate or a particular platform item, okay, cool. Like we know that can happen. It has happened. But then what does it actually do for really attacking what the root of the problem is would be my question.
So I'm really interested in talking this through with you both. Let's talk about, if we can, what happens when we name it. I think the cynical part of me, there's a cynical part of my brain that says, for so long, all we could get in politics, I mean, it's still the case, but all we can get in politics at best for Black people is a politician saying, I see you, I hear you, I will recognize this thing. And I'm frustrated by the extent to which neolibs these days in particular have been extremely effective at co-opting all of the language about quote unquote naming white supremacy. So Kamala Harris will get up. She basically said on the debate stage a bunch of times, this is white supremacist country. I'm going to, that little girl was me, yada, yada, Joe Biden, Jim Crow Dro. Like she got her little shots in. Elizabeth Warren is excellent at saying all of the right things about structural racism and how we have debt owed and redlining and all the things. Like she is very good at saying exactly what she needs, what someone who has my academic background, your guys' academic background will want her to say. That sounds good on the lecture circuit at college, university. And then they get into office and they don't do jack. They don't do anything. So I want to just background that as that's part of my skepticism about what it does to actually name something. Everyone gets up. It was just Thanksgiving. Everybody will stand up and say, we're on stolen land. Let's recognize the genocide. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I mean, I'm not Native American, but I guess that's, to a lot of people, that's probably seems like better than nothing and ignoring the reality of the holiday. But it also is giving zero land back to anybody or changing the material reality of Native American people. And at a certain point, it can start to feel a little indulgent from my perspective. Humbly, I'm not speaking for any Native Americans. Obviously, they can feel very differently than me. So I want to know structurally, materially, what changes when we, quote unquote, name it, say the thing. Because what is happening currently is that people like Warren and a lot of these kind of like woker politicians name the thing. And what that has the effect of doing is making them not very good politically, not do very well politically. We saw what happened to Kamala Harris and Warren both. And there's some people who argue that Bernie didn't do as well in 2020 as 2016 because he leaned into more of that language, although I don't necessarily agree with that. And meanwhile, people who are not at all woke win and then enact their, fascist policies.
My take on that would be that's because they're naming it within the confines of this system and structure that isn't designed to do anything for us to begin with. And so for me, a part of naming it is also a beginning part of the process of divesting from all of this shit. Because I am a person that is of the opinion that electoral politics in the US is, and we were going to come to this next, do we get maybe some pressure relief valves that open up through certain bills that domestically make room for certain things under certain administrations and not under others? For sure. Like, yes, those things happen. We have those kinds of fluctuations, but there's not been a single president in the history of this country. There's not been a single person who has held an important level office in the history of this country who is actually thinking about the well-being of the masses of people. And so when we begin to have that conversation within the confines of electoral politics, we're not going anywhere with it, because that's what electoral politics in the US is about. Electoral politics in the US is about maintaining U.S. hegemony domestically and internationally. And so because for me, we even have to have that conversation beyond domestic racial politics, because there might be somebody like a Bernie Sanders or somebody like a Barack Obama might appear to be progressive or maybe left in the U.S. context when it comes to domestic issues, but when it comes to international policy, they are all bloodthirsty beasts.
Imperialist.
So
yeah. Well, so let me ask you this then. So you pointed out, I think, and I agree, that there are plenty of people who say the right thing and then get into office and do nothing, or prospectively might be good domestically but not internationally, or what have you. And that ultimately you need someone who's sincerely committed to the cause, who sincerely understands the kind of structural reforms that the real left, the left wants. If that person existed and did not speak in the way that, doesn't name the thing, if that person existed and sounds more like 2016 Bernie, let's say, than Elizabeth Warren, is that a problem?
Here's the thing though, Briahna, and I think that when you talk about, so the naming, having a racial lens does work because it's working for the right. That wokeism shit is a racial lens. They're doing precisely what whatever quote unquote progressives are blamed of, but in reverse. But beyond that, here's the thing. I think that we need to, again, when we're calling things racist or pointing out the racial dynamics of a given material reality, it's important because, for example, if we don't point out or we don't constantly name when things are racist, this is how people can then be against apportioning particular monies to a Black community, for example, that have their water poisoned, right? Mm-hmm. We have to point out the racial dynamics of things because race exacerbate that. If we believe in this idea of super exploitation or the way that race and oppression exacerbate particular dynamics, then it doesn't seem, it won't seem unjust to the regular person to eradicate those ills. And again, and I think that we can put it in everyday language, but I think that we do have to point out the racial dynamic, the way that race absolutely has a material effect and an economic effect. This doesn't mean that, kill off all the whites or whatever people are saying. It's not that, but rather saying that the ways that racial capitalism, as we call it, is set up is that for people to truly come together, right? There is a particular type of amelioration that racialized people have to get because they're Black, not because they're Black, but rather because of the ways that their Blackness has been a material condition for a very, very long time. And again, it's not about shaming white people for being racist, but saying when you vote against particular things or when you put yourself out against particular things, it is rooted in a racialized understanding of who and how much.
But I agree with that. That last sentence you said, that last little framing that says when you vote against particular things, you're hurting yourself, you're buying into a racial paradigm, you're being
it's
convinced.
Racist. The right. Short all of that is it's racist.
But Cherise, if people hear what you said last, I think that they would agree with you. And the reality is that when you say it's racist, people don't understand what that means. We all wish that people understood that what it means, and we should continue to work toward people understanding what that means for those of us who've sat through a million sociology class and gone to college. But in the real world, 30% of Americans have had that kind of experience? We gotta be realistic about why is it that there is this huge education divide that is falling along political lines now. It's not just because stupid people like Trump. Like, no, it's because people who have had the benefit of a certain kind of education have had the unpacking of what all these terms mean and are much more likely to buy into these arguments as well. I think they should. I am that person. Me, right? Me. However, if putting it the way that you put it at the end there enables people to hear it and agree with you, in a way that saying it's racist doesn't, I don't understand. It's not walking away from race. It's not saying anything at all. It's like saying, okay, I support defunding the police as a slogan, but if I'm in a certain context, I'm not going to bust into church and walk up to some 80-year-old grandma who lives in a crime-ridden neighborhood and say defund the police. I'm going to say, it turns out, ma'am, that increasing police funding doesn't actually lower crime in your neighborhood. I know that crime is a big problem in your neighborhood. What if we took some funding and gave it to social services that would make the root causes of crime go down in your neighborhood? I'm going to read the room. That's all I'm saying. I'm going to read the audience. And you brought up the example of Flint, Michigan, the pipes before, lead in pipes. Ever since the Flint crisis came up, like got put on the map politically and people started talking about it, Barack Obama was the president of the United States. He was a black president, right? It has been racialized from the jump. Flint is a majority black city, I believe, but it's about 50-50 or maybe 60-40. It's still a lot of white people who live in Flint, right? The narrative is this is a city that has had this kind of neglect. This kind of neglect is allowed. These kids are being poisoned and the community is being poisoned in this way because America doesn't care about black people. I believe that to be true. It's not about my belief. I think you can look at history and patterns and the way politics and money flows, that is just true, and that's the fact of the matter. However, all of that narrative has done absolutely nothing to get a single dollar going to fixing Flint's pipes. Now, there's some money in Build Back Better, but it's insufficient to actually do the job, right? And the money exists. We could have fixed Flint. And there's, I think, 3,000 other cities in America that are similarly situated, by the way, some of which are disproportionately black and brown, probably more than, disproportionately so, but some of which a lot of white people being affected too. And I guess my question is, and it's genuinely a question, I'm open to this. I don't have my ideological heels dug in here. What purpose is it serving? Is there an actual, something moving forward? Are the people of Flint being helped by a narrative that says, Flint is happening because America is racist? True. Versus a narrative that says, we are being convinced to ignore Flint. You're being convinced to accept the reality of what's happening in Flint and hundreds and thousands of countries across this country. Because you're being told there's not enough money for X, Y, and Z by the same people who are funneling money to corporate interests. The reason that the Flint pipes happened in the first place was because, Schneider refunneled the money, the water to go to the Nestle plant, or whatever, the car of my manufacturing plant, because they didn't want their parts to rust, and that was seen as more of a priority than the human beings in the city, right? And just diversifying the narrative a bit, broadening the narrative a bit, framing the narrative in a way that doesn't sound like that, I think is honest and true, and actually reflective of both the race and class dynamics at play here, and the way that race is being used as a weapon against poor white people as well as poor black people. And they are, to your point, being seduced into voting against their interests because of racism, yes. But I think that can be put to them in a way that doesn't necessarily make them the villain in a story when, frankly, they are being exploited along with everybody else in this game.
But poor white people are, but it's not just an elite white thing. The thing is, yes, the Debsian, every model, right, is that the ruling class is using racism to split the working class. True. But I think that when we do research historically, and again, I can be accused of being an academic because I know shit, I guess, but the white working class has also historically weaponized whiteness of their own accord. And so you mentioned wages of whiteness. That is David Roediger. David Roediger writes precisely about this. And so when we only make it an elite corporate machination, it is distorting what the actual material dynamics are, period. And so I think, to your point, perhaps we can call it fucking babaloo bop and not racism, but we have to get at the reality that it is not just the rich white folks duping the poor white people. It's not just that. They have a vested interest in it. Even if, and it's like, well, they're also poor. Well, maybe it's not a sort of an income outcome, so to speak, but there's a benefit to it, obviously, or there's a way. Bacon's rebellion. Everybody, anyway, I can go on about a lot of things, but what I'm saying is that
do Bacon's rebellion. I want to hear what you're saying about Bacon's rebellion.
Well, Bacon's rebellion is supposed to be like this white, the solidarity of like, white people with enslaved Africans and all this other thing. But it really had to do, Bacon's rebellion was about Britain not clearing out the Native Americans fast enough. And so they rebelled because there enough land from the indigenous was not being dispossessed for them to have their own settlements. And so that is really about is the breakdown of a particular type of cross-class collaboration that is fundamental to the establishment of the United States, whereby then pragmatically Yao Ming whites link up with some enslaved Africans to exterminate Native Americans. And so I think that likewise, we have to understand how, because racialized understanding and racism are endemic in the way that we have always related to each other, there has to be a way to call out how when white people vote against particular things or are against particular things as a knee-jerk reaction, it is indeed racism. And then we can point out how that racism is hindering their own reality. And it's beyond just some sort of false consciousness. And so to your point, I don't exactly know how to do that, I guess, if white people are going to always evade racism. You know, it does become a moot point, but it has to be done, period.
Look, it's not that you're wrong, of course, or that I'm disagreeing with you even, but I'm still waiting. I'm waiting for the evidence that framing things in these terms. I mean, the framing things in these terms works. That it's moving the needle or helping helping change the material reality of the world. Now, part of what's happening, part of the problem here is that there's a collapse between the spaces where different kinds of language are used. And that's because of social media. It's because of the world we live in the internet and stuff. So whereas you could have discrete conversations in various communities back in yesteryear, now it's going to be taped and put on the internet, and you're going to be accused of, having an inside and outside language and all that kind of stuff. But I also think, oh boy, look, part of the problem is I have no issue with, and I in fact actively encourage, and it should be the case, that in when you're already speaking to the choir largely, or people who are like borderline enough to become part of the choir, that kind of language is very effective, and people should be informed about how to have conversations about what systemic racism is and how racism manifests out in the world. We should be deputizing these soldiers in college, and they can go off and be informed in the way that we're all informed here. But I just am struggling to see, you used the word call out earlier, and it feels to me like so much of the urge to call out is about one's own feelings. And I don't mean this as an accusation. I feel this of myself as well, to kind of performatively assuage my own feelings of righteousness. And I am right. I feel righteous. Like, I think I'm right. But I don't know that is productive. And the fact that the liberals with the biggest platforms, who are basically defining what it is to be a liberal or a Democrat or whatever, are using what used to be private academic niche language on the platforms that they have on the mainstream news, where there is not the time and the space to unpack and explain, I think is a kind of, I think it's a real vulnerability. Because what they're doing, it's like they've taken all of these tools and lingo and words that are useful and good, and they're just it's like causing all these self-inflicted wounds because they don't know what they're doing. People like Don Lemon are not invested in connecting it to any class project. They're using all of that terminology to basically shore themselves up as the most righteous, victimized person in the world, even if they may earn $1 million a year, millions of dollars a year. And they turn what is, I think, a real materialist analysis into a kind of a victim narrative that the right then rightly picks up on. Don Lemon and the rest of them. Sorry, I don't want to keep focusing on Don Lemon. There's other people, but the rest of them basically turn the entire racial struggle into, I didn't get promoted fast enough at MSNBC, and it seems vapid and shallow and superficial and racially reductive, in a way that then the right turns around and says, this is just about elite blacks trying to get ahead of you. They're telling you you're privileged when he makes so much more than you, and you're down here as a coal miner or a fast food worker or whatever you are. And if there were the space, if people were doing this well, if there were hour-long shows on prime time where people could have these kinds of conversations, I would be 100% for it. But there does seem to me to be something kind of short-sighted about the fact that that is just not where we are. And I don't know, what is the benefit? What have we seen as the benefit of, in the public sphere? I'm not talking about in the academic sphere or wherever, but in the public political sphere, defining Flint water crisis exclusively in racial terms, or calling out Trump voters for being racist, even though I think they're racist. I think I'm racist. I think, is there a diminishing utility of these terms, which I think are so important, and these ideas that are so important, because they're being poorly deployed in a broader public discourse that is not equipped to define these terms or to direct the narrative in appropriate ways?
Sorry, Layla. I just wanted to say, I just wonder what, and this is rhetorical, I guess, but where have our conditions improved when we didn't name racism?
So that was actually what I was going to ask.
Okay.
That was actually what I was going to ask, because the question that you're saying, like, what is the benefit? So I'm curious about this, and I was going to relate it to a question about the Build Back Better bill, because so when you ask what is the benefit, and so one of the things that drove the kind of narrative around the sort of last presidential election cycle was, we just have to get Trump out, and that anything is better than Trump. And now what we're looking at is a presidential administration that has essentially reneged on every promise that it has made, right? And so that brings me to this question about, so the way that people were silenced for critiquing Kamala, the way that people were silenced or shamed for silencing or critiquing Kamala or Biden, because what was the most politically expedient and important thing at that moment was to get Trump out. What do we now benefit? What now comes out of what Eugene Puryear has referred to as the Build Back Never bill, as what some people have referred to as the Build Back Basic bill? There were all of these promises.
I coined that TM.
That all of these promises that sort of push people to vote a particular way in this last presidential election that we have not seen the benefit of. And so then I would ask you that same question: what is the benefit of that? And then I would ask you to sort of relate it to what's happening with the Build Back Better bill.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, and my answer is that I think that what is happening with Build Back Better and the entire Biden agenda is what I'm afraid of happens when there is this when politics ends up getting reduced to stating the thing and calling the name and calling it out, and because I'm telling you, the Dems are good at that now. And a lot of how they were able to marshal people to come out and vote for Joe Biden and Kamala, and to see Trump as a world historic, unique villain, as opposed to a Republican, the way that they all have been here doing the same terrible things since the time of Memorial, is by leveraging that kind of academic language of calling out and speaking truth to power and talking about racism. The entire narrative in 2020 was Trump is a racist, and that's why we shouldn't like him. Biden is not a racist, which is all that is required of you. I mean, he is, but by the definitions of racism that folks are operating with, everyone's got a bad definition of racism, and so do liberals. Biden good, Trump bad. Kamala black, Kamala good. Kamala black, Kamala gonna work for black people.
But
right?
Nobody felt that way about Kamala. Like no black people, ain't not a single black person except maybe the AKA.
Right. Right, but Sharice
said, yay, Kamala, because she black. They was like, fuck that bitch.
Right, but here's the thing. So much of what's going on here is that black academic speak is being used to launder white liberal opinion. And our friend Pascal talks about this all the time. The purpose that people like Joy and Rita and all these other black people in media are serving is to pretend, is to wrap up, to launder, to manufacture consent. And because this kind of woke world we live in, white liberals know they have to get buy-in from black people. They don't have to get buy-in from real black people, but if the black people in the media sphere line up and say this is the best thing to do, if Martin Luther King III and even Reverend Barber line up and say go ahead and vote for Joe Biden, if what's his name, Jim Clyburn, and all of them line up and say, go ahead and vote for Joe Biden. You can make a face sure, but at the end of the day, what was it? 60% of black voters in South Carolina. I'm making up numbers, but it was a lot of voters in South Carolina said that Jim Clyburn's endorsement was dispositive for them and how they were going to vote in 2020.
No, it's absolutely true. I'm making a face because Jim Clyburn is. I can fuck with there, like period. But no, I think you're not incorrect yet.
So I don't think that we're necessarily disagreeing. I guess what I'm saying is that I think that the greater likelihood in what we've seen is that perfectly good nature, well-intended academic speak is being used to launder a neoliberal agenda. And I don't think that saying the thing and doing the thing and calling out the thing is effective, and that emphasizing that disproportionately in some ways enables people to say, oh, Bernie is trash, let's vote for Kamala, let's vote for Sister Hillary, and ignore the material arguments. If we lived in a world where everyone was talking about class, right, and everyone was voting based on class and everyone was ignoring race, I would have a different analysis for sure. But right now, there is a superficial, at least, conversation happening about race because Democrats have realized that's a way that they can launder their neoliberal project. And so the thing to me, when you said ultimately you need the person who's going to do the right thing when they get into office, because so many people haven't and nobody really ever has. To me, I'm laser focused on finding who that is and then relating to communities why that person is going to work for them and what they're going to do. And some of the rhetoric around calling out race, well, I think it's a useful framework for people who are policymakers and are in government so that they don't have the same kind of lapses and omissions that we had in the New Deal era that excluded black people from things. I think it's incredibly important for people to be aware of how racism manifests today in systemic and structural issues. And maybe this is just my bias as a messenger and someone who is focused on that aspect of things. I find there to be real diminishing returns on that stuff because of how I've seen it weaponized to launder a neoliberal agenda. I think that's kind of where I am right now.
Yeah, I think that there's two things happening together that are sort of being elided. And one is the way that liberals, white and black alike, race hustle. Mm-hmm. And there's another thing that's white folks don't like being called racist. So calling things racist is going to alienate them. I think that both of those things are problematic. And I think that we have to understand, and I think that you're absolutely right. People don't have no class analysis such that they think that education, New York Times use education as a proxy for class, which is fucking wild.
Yeah.
Right. And so I agree absolutely with what you're saying. But I think that there has to be, we have to understand how class is racialized, period. We have to do it because it's generally been one or the other. And there have been people who have regular ass people, non-academic people, regular run-of-the-mill people who have been able to hold both. Mm-hmm. And I think that we just have to get that back. But I think perhaps to your point, politicians ain't gonna do it because politicians are doing it to win elections, not to serve the people. They're elected influencers at this point. And so I don't know that they're gonna engage race or class in any type of good faith. So
I wish we were having a conversation about how class is racialized. I wish we were having it in the public sphere on TV. I wish Don Lemon were having it. I wish Tucker Carlson were having it. Right? That is constructive.
Say Don Lemon. Just get it out because you really on his head today. Just say it. Hey, Don Lemon.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to stay off Joyanne Reid because, I've said enough about her in my life. And I don't know who else is there manufacturing consent rate. I feel like Lester Holt isn't really on TV like that. But yeah, I what's so funny to me, let me lay my cards on the table. I am often accused of, and I understand, like, when you asked me earlier, like, what does your blackness do for you? I would not be making any of these arguments if I weren't black, right? Because I understand no one would take me in good faith at all if I were some white person saying, let's not talk about race. And I don't think that's what I'm saying, but like, that's how it would come off. I'm literally saying, let's talk about race. Let's talk about race in a deeper, more substantive way than where anyone's talking about it. But I think that is enabled by not always leading with you're racist. And we can get there. But I don't think that any human being who's ever spoken to another human being and tried to convince them about anything in the history of humanity would disagree that coming in hot with as polarizing an accusation as that is, even if it's true. I just sat, I'm home for the holidays. That's why my camera's not on. I apologize to, viewers. And I'm not in my greatest element. But, you're home, you're having conversation with family, and you love these people. But they be getting on your last nerve. And I have some of the most knockdown, drag out conversations with my brother, who's a lovely human being, but who is a Cancer and I'm a Leo. And we are cut from different cloth. And I will come to the discussion. I'll be like, I need him to understand something right now. And there is a truth that I believe in my head about what he needs to do differently in his life or whatever it is we're disagreeing about. But I know that if I come in hot and say, this is what I think about your situation, we are getting nowhere. And it's not about what he deserves to hear or anything like that. It just is not how people are persuaded. It's just, if I believed, I don't have some ideological opposition to telling people they're racist. If I believed that saying America is racist, Trump voters are racist, people are not changing the flight, fixing the pipes in Flint because of racism, if I thought that moved the needle even 1%, I would be whole hog in with you on that. I would. I don't have, it's no skin off my back to say any of that stuff. I'm for it. In fact, I believe it. But based on the definitions of racism that I understand from my life, my 7 years in the academic land. However, 30% of Americans have gone to college. 9 out of 10 Americans believe that racism is when someone says the N-word, or a Klans member strings somebody up a tree, or someone says, I'm not going to rent a house to you because you're black. And I think we need to have a conversation about how that's not what racism means. That racism is something bigger than that before we have a conversation about how you're all racist. That's all I'm saying is that it's like an order of operations issue.
Thinking about how to figure out this race thing and how to get our material needs met, I think is a good stopping point. We don't have any, as I always say, I don't have any solutions. I'm just trying to understand the problem. And I think that what we've had is a sort of productive conversation about the nature of the problem and just how to understand not only how to understand the problem, but how to get others to address the problem in a way that is to the benefit of the majority, right? So. Mm-hmm.
Well, look, I'm glancing at my phone to see what kind of Twitter activity has been happening in my absence. And a gentleman who I've had recently on the podcast, who I like a lot, who we disagree about this approach. He's on the radical opposite end of me in terms of what we need to do about, quote, the whites. And he just tweeted in response to one of my tweets, his solution is, quote, you need a cultural program that fights a total war. We have to rewire the whites in terms of property rights, civil rights, rights as legal subjects, political rights, and the education conditions of fitful participation in the nation. He has gone on in other instances to talk about we need to critique the white church and other kinds of institutions. And while I understand what he's saying, I think coming in hot, talking about we need to cancel the white church when we live in a nation that many people describe as a Christian nation. Imagine we told black people, you guys are so conservative, you voted for Biden, we need to cancel the black church. We need to rewire the black church. What your response would be? Nobody would recommend saying some nonsense like that, right? And all I'm saying is I think that this kind of approach, while I respect Iremy and what he's up to, I think a cultural program against whiteness, if you told me there was a cultural program against blackness, I'd tell you to get out of my face. And I don't expect white people to behave any differently. And I think that we need to think about what this kind of language sounds like. And what other kinds of language sounds like, because at the end of the day, someone like Joe Rogan, like him or not, has a huge following because he's perceived to be someone who is willing to talk to anybody. And he said, well, I like Bernie. I'd probably vote for Bernie. And millions of people would have potentially followed him into that direction. And I think there's room for someone like him, even if I have my critiques, just like there's room for people, academics like Iremy, and there's room for people like you and me that are somewhere in between those two poles, right? I think there's room for a lot of different voices and a lot of different approaches. And I definitely think that the approach that you're advocating for has a place and is necessary. Somebody somewhere needs to be keeping their eye on the ball about how systems should be structured and how racism is still operating, because eventually when we get in charge, somebody has to be able to attack those systems and do it justice. Mm-hmm. But for someone to get in charge, whether it's through electoral or more revolutionary means, we're going to have to figure out how to get enough people on the same page. And I'm open to different ways to doing that, but given the exigency that our communities are in, the you got to give up your privilege for me argument without foregrounding how it's going to help you too as a working class or poor white person, I think is a little bit, that's a longer wait that I'm willing to set our people up for, and all the marginalized people of this country up for.
The last thing, well, they're not giving up their privilege for me. They're giving up their privilege for them, because their privilege has gotten them very little and has gotten us even less.
Well, yes, I agree. We should say that.
Okay.
I completely agree. We should say exactly that. And that's the messaging that works from the Demo study. That's Heather McGhee's pitch. That works on people. It really does.
Because your ass is racist. I'm just like, okay. Thank you so much, Bree. This has been such a great conversation, and we hope to have you back to speak about, you have some of the, most sort of insightful and up-to-date analysis on what's actually happening in mainstream politics. Me and Layla, we don't really pay attention that much because we divested. But
don't say that. You people loved when you were on, by the way, Dr. CBS. Like, you were very popular. People, and I think the left needs to hear from more voices like yours. Like, I don't agree with a lot of guests on every single thing, but I feel like a lot of simpatico with you, and I really appreciate your voice. I think there needs to be a lot more Black people in the left media space, and I would love to have you back. And Layla, it's so nice to meet you, and I would love to have you on Bad Faith as well.
Absolutely. And we need you to talk to the whites, because it ain't gonna be us. So thank you so much, Bree.
Yes. My pleasure. It truly is my pleasure.
I have to rant about this Omicron variant debacle. I swear the West wants Africa to be the vector of COVID so bad when all of the fucking data points otherwise. Certainly, okay, so this variant was discovered by South Africa by these South African scientists, and they did their due diligence by reporting it, but it's not only there. Why is it that the travel ban is only attacking Zimbabwe, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa, when the shit was also discovered already in Israel, in Belgium, and even in Canada? Why isn't there a travel ban against these European countries? I swear, like, the West they want the fact that Africa is not fitting into this whole narrative about it being the bastion of disease and poverty is really fucking with them. And they're doing everything that they can to blame or to make it seem as if South Africa, but the African continent as a whole, is not doing their due diligence, when in fact it's the West, by hoarding vaccines, by not temporarily suspending intellectual property laws, and by basically opening up too early or arbitrarily, or in some fucking implementing these hodgepodge rules that are actually keeping the virus and keeping the pandemic ongoing. So I just wish these motherfuckers would admit that they're racist, and that they're anti-Black, and that they're anti-African, and that the fact that Africa, in comparison to virtually every other place in the world, is doing what they're supposed to be doing is really fucking with their civilizational narrative. Just admit that, and don't make it seem as if you're doing some fucking international public health service. Just admit you racist, admit that you colonial, admit that you're imperial, and admit that you mad. How about that? And fuck the Omicron variant too.
And that is our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Layla Brown, here with my girl CBS. And thanks as always to Two Black in the Back. And we are signing off. See you next time.